Okay, I want to talk about deprogramming America. Let me back up a little bit. Back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, I mean, it's still going on, but in fact, probably its most visible manifestation now is Scientology. But there were all these cults in the United States. You had the Maharaji, who was the 14-year-old perfect master who, essentially said he was like Jesus. A friend of mine was in his cult. In fact, my friend got kidnapped out of that cult and deprogrammed by Ted Patrick, and then went to work with Ted Patrick to deprogram others. You had the Moonies. You had Reverend Moon, who explicitly said that he was the reincarnation of Jesus, and all these Mooney followers. So you had these cults. Now, these were relatively benign cults in that they took kids away from their families. They isolated people, but they didn't lead to death. I mean, the most extreme example of that was Jim Jones. Jim Jones had a cult that was actually a death cult. He moved down to Guyana, and they all drank the Kool-Aid literally and died. Nations can be seized by cults, just like religions can be seized by cults. I lived in Germany in '86 and '87, and if you read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Scherer or other books, I mean, I was there. Not during the World War II, obviously, but living in Germany, I knew some old Nazis, literally people who had been in Hitler's army, or who were. In fact, I knew one guy who was still a Nazi. He's now dead, but he's an old guy from that era. And what happened in Germany and happened in Japan, and we can find modern-day parallels to this with Slobodan Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic and is it Bosnia or Serbia? I mix up that part of the world. And frankly, ISIS right now. And in fact, I would say, Wahhabism in general. What you find are these basically death cults. They are cults every bit as much as the Maharajis or Reverend Moon's is a cult. But they're cults that involve the subjection or murder, or usually both, of, quote, inferior people. We played with this in the United States in two big ways. Most recently, against people of all races in the 1920s with the euthanasia movement, where we were sterilizing women who were mentally retarded and people who were born with birth defects. We were sterilizing them. Our eugenics movement, well, the eugenics movement actually began in England. It came out of Herbert Spencer, Charles Darwin's cousin, who was an economist, and a few other people, and came to the United States. And we did it big time. And Hitler actually used our eugenics posters about, cleansing the race, essentially, in his early campaigns in the early 1930s. So throughout the 1930s and right up toward the end of the World War II, in Germany, you had Germans who actually believed that Hitler was somehow associated with Jesus, that he might be John the Baptist, he might be the reincarnation of Jesus, and Hitler himself was saying he was bringing 1,000-year Reich. Ein Volk, ein Welt, ein Reich, ein Führer. One world, one people, one leader. Similarly, and you had German soldiers, enthusiastically not just going off to die, but also killing people. From Auschwitz to Belsen to Dachau, although Dachau was technically a work camp, not a death camp, but a lot of people died there. I think Dachau, if you want to draw parallels, would be probably more similar to American plantations. It was a slave labor camp. And they were all over Germany, by the way. There were hundreds of them. And they were manufacturing commercial goods. So you had a death cult in Germany. In Japan, you had a death cult. Emperor worship. When Admiral Perry first broke Japan open to the world in the late 19th century, as I recall, with his black ships arriving and just shocking the Japanese. The Japanese response to Perry literally forcing at gunpoint the Japanese to allow Americans and Europeans to come in and trade with them and interact with them was xenophobic nationalism and racism and emperor worship. The Japanese had always, to a certain extent, believed that the emperor was the reincarnation, or not the reincarnation, was the last, whoever was the emperor was the last in the long lineage that went back to the very first man. And the very first man was born from the sun god. So essentially, the emperor was like, the descendant of Jesus Christ sort of thing, the descendant of the Son of God. If Jesus had had children and they had had children and they had had children and it had passed down all these generations and the Pope was actually could claim a bloodline back to Jesus, that's how it was in Japan. And people were so committed to this man that they thought was divine that they were willing to commit suicide, the kamikaze pilots, all this kind of thing. This sort of death cult, Radovan Karadzic and Slobodan Milosevic. Karadzic was a psychiatrist. He actually, and his goal was to cleanse the Muslims from that part of what was originally Yugoslavia, as I recall. And he did it by setting up rape camps where they would bring in hundreds of thousands of Muslim women and have good Christian soldiers rape them repeatedly until they were impregnated. And the more blonde the soldiers, the better. Hitler was doing something very similar in many cases. These are death cults. You wake up out of a death cult when you realize that it was a death cult. Most people, they get caught up in a cult. They don't even realize they're in a cult. It was losing World War II that woke up the Germans and woke up the Japanese to the death cult of Nazism and the death cult of emperor worship. It was losing the war. It was losing the war in the former Yugoslavia that woke up many of the Serbs or the Bosnians. I forget. My apologies. I forget which is which. Here in the United States, we had a death cult that was running an institution called slavery for several hundred years. We had concentration camps that we call plantations for several hundred years. That death cult is still alive and well in the South. And it's not just in the South, by the way. This is why up in Wisconsin, when Scott Walker said, we're going to make welfare recipients pee in a cup before they get their welfare. Even though, drug abuse among people on welfare is actually lower than pretty much any other group. We're going to humiliate them. Why? Well, because, and he mentioned Milwaukee, which has got a very large black population, because they're black people, of course. Racism and slavery are inextricably tied. Paul Krugman, on June 22nd, in his piece, Slavery's Long Shadow, he says, as recently as the 1980s, half of all Americans opposed interracial marriage. Think about that for a second. He said, race made Reaganism possible. And to this day, Southern whites overwhelmingly vote Republican to the tune of 85 to 90% in the Deep South. Then he looked at another paper that was done in 2001 by some relatively conservative economists, actually, titled, Why Doesn't the United States Have a European-Style Welfare State? Why, it turns out? Well, because most white people think that most welfare goes to black people. They're wrong, but they think that. And so there you go. He points out the 2012 Supreme Court, gave states the ability to block expanding Medicaid. Who turned such a thing down? 22 states, 80% of the population was in states that practiced slavery.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Only one former member of the Confederacy has expanded Medicaid. Why? A history of slavery. So how do we deal with this cult?